The Templars and Hospitallers were the most famous military orders of the Crusades, but many others were founded in their image, and some endured and evolved long after the Christian recovery of the Holy Land had come to an end. Of these, the Teutonic Knights were the most successful, becoming a sovereign power that would dominate the Baltic region for 250 years and ultimately form the basis for the Kingdom of Prussia. The story of the order was exploited by German nationalist historians from the 19th century, culminating in a typically Nazi absurdity. The Catholic charitable order into which the Teutonic Knights had evolved was suppressed, while Nazi propaganda literally made the Knights poster boys for Hitler's drive to the east. Like the Order of the Knights Templar, upon whom it modelled itself, the Teutonic Order of St. Mary's Hospital in Jerusalem began with a handful of volunteers, in this case at a field hospital outside Acre in 1190. The city had been captured by the Muslims in the wake of the fall of Jerusalem. The beleaguered Christian kingdom was reduced to a tiny army struggling to retake the city, without which no relief effort could be expected from the west. After the recapture of Acre and the stabilization of the remaining Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, the order expanded thanks to the endorsement of Emperor Henry VI, who obtained from them a charter of incorporation from the Pope and permission to use the rule of the Templars. When his son, Frederick II, took the cross in 1215, he appointed the Knights Master a Prince of the Empire. Frederick's 1229 Crusade re-established Christian control of the hinterland of Acre, and there, some 30 miles inland, the author established its fortress of Starkenburg or Montfort. By the mid-1200s, the Teutonic Order could field several hundred knights, which made it a significant asset to the Crusader kingdom. And in 1258, the Templars and Hospitallers recognized the Teutonic Knights as an independent, equal military order. The final collapse of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1291 was not regarded as the end of the matter by the religious military orders, who regrouped on Cyprus. However, no major Western monarch was prepared to mount another expedition to the Holy Land. And even worse, King Philip of France, who had urged the Vatican to amalgamate the military orders under his own control, now saw the Templars' wealth as a solution to his financial troubles. In 1307, he struck. And it can be no coincidence the Hospitallers promptly invaded the island of Rhodes and established themselves as a sovereign state beyond reach of any king. The Teutonic Knights, who'd based themselves in Venice, one of the traditional embarkation points for the Holy Land, now relocated themselves to the shore of the Baltic Sea, the region known as Prussia. Why Prussia? Let's backtrack 150 years or so to when the crusading movement was at its height, and all the leading monarchs of Europe were prepared to take the cross themselves. The First Crusade liberated Jerusalem in 1099 and led to the establishment of 4 Crusader states. One, the County of Edessa, lasted but 40 years before it fell to the Muslim forces in December 1144. When Pope Eugenius III proclaimed a new crusade to save the Holy Land, the highly influential Cistercian abbot St. Bernard of Clairvaux succeeded in putting together a massive French and South German expedition to the Middle East. But the response to his call to arms was weak in North Germany, where Saxon nobles were much more preoccupied with the pagan Slavs on their own borders. They pressed Bernard to be allowed to attack these local enemies instead, which Pope Eugenius approved. And this mission creep was repeated in Spain, where the King of Castile successfully lobbied for Crusader privileges to be applied to his own wars with the Muslim states. This is the Powder Tower at Riga, now the Latvian War Museum, and part of the remaining fortifications established there by the local bishop. It was a small Christian enclave, and he assembled a small force of a military order of his own to protect it. And so as the war for Jerusalem was expanded to cover fighting pagans, Muslims, and even Orthodox Christians, the military orders expanded their geographical reach accordingly. The Templars and Hospitallers both operated in Spain and in Northern Europe, manning castles east of the River Oder in Poland. And the Spanish Order of Calatrava held lands around Danzig. Critics of the crusading movement, then and nowadays, argue it was these expansions which diluted its core mission, retaking Jerusalem and the Holy Land, to the point that the crusading became just politics by another means. In the wake of the storming of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the Catholic Church launched a determined campaign against the Orthodox Faith. Pope Honorius III insisted the Greek rite was not to be allowed in any lands governed by Latins. In northwest Europe, then, that meant war with the Orthodox Christian state of Novgorod. For all their lofty ideals, the Northern Crusades have been widely regarded as no more than territorial aggrandizement camouflaged beneath a religious smokescreen. And the baleful influence of generations of Marxist historians has continued to cloud the issue. However, in the best English language study of the period, The Northern Crusades, which I heartily recommend to the House, Eric Christensen sees no reason to doubt the sincerity of the Crusaders. From the time of the First Crusade, a time of profound religiosity throughout Europe, German and Scandinavian rulers began to look at their eastern neighbours in a new and religious light. The ensuing Northern Crusades were fought by men who, according to Christensen, were never reluctant to wage war for profit, fame, vengeance, or merely to pass the time, without any disguise or need for a pretext. But when they fought these wars under the banner of the cross, often at considerable personal cost, perhaps they deserved to be taken at their word. Papal support for the Northern Crusades, combined with the successful recruiting in Germany, enabled the Teutonic Knights to deploy massive force to Prussia. By 1244, when the Teutonic Order's 300 or so knights in the Holy Land were wiped out at the Battle of Lachfurbi, it had a substantially larger force in the Baltic, although many were temporary reinforcements, thanks to Pope Innocent IV's offer of full indulgences to those who took the cross and went to Prussia. For a German wishing to take the cross, that meant crusading vows could be completed in a matter of weeks in Prussia, as opposed to a year or more in the Holy Land, then home for tea and medals. The result was a vast influx of men, from individuals to major nobles like Margrave Henry of Meissen, who in 1233 didn't just sign himself up, but brought 500 knights with him. By the time the Teutonic Order was forced to withdraw from the Holy Land, the ancient tribes of Prussia were all but overwhelmed, leaving the Christian powers confronting the last great pagan state in Europe, Lithuania. The Lithuania of 1300 included not just the present-day country, but a vast swathe of what is now Poland and northwest Russia. Ruled by a recognizably knightly class of mounted warriors and blessed with a series of intelligent and ruthless leaders, Lithuania had grown into one of the most powerful kingdoms in medieval Europe, and that was in spite of Christian attacks from the west and a Mongol invasion in the south. Within a few years of the Teutonic Order establishing its headquarters in Prussia, the Grand Master found himself in the Lithuanian citadel of Vilnius, negotiating a truce with Grand Prince Gediminas. Successive Lithuanian invasions had carried off some 20,000 Christians into slavery and sacked many towns, including the port of Memel, which is why the Grand Master found himself here at Trakai Castle outside of Vilnius, which has been massively restored since and even appears in Game of Thrones. The truce negotiated here was just to buy time, and the story of the 1300s is raid and counter-raid, and the gigantic statue of Gediminas looms over the square in Vilnius to this day, commemorating an unreconstructed pagan ruler. And when he was eventually murdered in a palace coup, his funeral pyre was graced with living slaves as human sacrifice. These are the city walls of Tallinn, built about the same time. During the century of almost continuous border raids through the 1300s, which were punctuated by invasions and counter-invasions, the Lithuanians and the Teutonic Order both grew richer and more powerful. However, Lithuania had more room to expand and would eventually combine with Poland to create an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. We can deal with that another time. The key take-home point is that by the time the Teutonic Order transferred its headquarters and eventually its whole operation to the Baltic, its primary opponents were no longer poorly armed pagan tribes of Prussia. They were the Lithuanians who could build and defend modern castles. The museum at Kaunas has a magnificent diorama of the siege of 1386 that culminated in the Teutonic Knights storming the fortress seen here, which is reduced to a single tower and a stretch of wall, having been taken and retaken several times in the war. The Lithuanians were able to deploy even more substantial field armies, until at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, also known as the Battle of Tannenberg, they enjoyed a considerable numerical advantage. Major battles were extremely rare during the Northern Crusades, in no small part because the consequence of losing one was so catastrophic, as in Grunwald, where the entire leadership of the Teutonic Order was annihilated. The environment played its part in this too. The belt of land separating the Order's settlements and the Lithuanian heartland was 100 miles of forest, swamp, lakes and streams, and not a single road. Baltic winters can be brutal, with sustained temperatures of -30 centigrade. Perversely, mild winters, like spring, were equally impossible for fighting when snowmelt overfilled the rivers and turned vast swathes of the countryside into waterlogged quagmire. There are only two sets of conditions favourable to military operations: a winter just cold enough to freeze the rivers and harden the ground, or a hot summer with favourable winds which would enable troops and supplies to move by river. Unhelpfully, weather was less predictable here than deeper into the Eurasian landmass, and all participants understood that a window of favourable fighting weather could last no more than a few weeks in any season. And so the war was prosecuted by smaller raids or racer. This is a typical target, a village in Latvia on the border of a lake, and the strange triangular thing in front of it is a smokehouse built from old boats. Winter raids would involve hundreds rather than thousands of men, with the aim of looting and devastating the target area as much and as fast as possible. They carried their rations with them, together with portable wooden cabins which they stored their food and plunder in, and also provide them with shelter from the intense cold at night. After a week or 10 days, hopefully faster than the defenders could assemble an army, the raiders would pull out, returning with captured loot in the form of cattle, horses, and prisoners. Summer raids, on the other hand, were much larger affairs, often with the objective of storming an enemy castle or advancing the frontier by building one of your own. Men came from all over Europe to join in, and it's worth remembering whether landed knights, professional crossbowmen, whoever, they all fought in all sorts of wars for all different causes. They did so out of obligation or for pay. But it was a very different matter when they took the cross and joined the Teutonic Knights on campaign, for they often paid their own way. In 1392, Henry Earl of Derby, later King Henry IV of England, spent 6 weeks there, spending £239 on his visit, which in modern terms is about £160,000. While there were occasions Grand Masters would offer wages to men who took the cross, and contemporary chronicler Froissart notes that men-at-arms cannot live on pardons, Eric Christiansen observes that nobody seems to have made a fortune out of fighting the Lithuanians, and most appear to have given more than they got. The 40 English knights who decided in 1349 to build a castle and a chapel on the Lithuanian frontier to receive converts and deter the heathen may have been misguided, but they were hardly cynical profiteers. The Teutonic Order had been in existence for just over 200 years, when in 1410 its army was annihilated at the Battle of Grunwald, and its headquarters were besieged. Although the siege was lifted and the Order did survive, this really was the Waterloo of the Order, and to this day it is marked with celebrations and reenactments in Poland and Lithuania. The battle was really a symptom rather than a cause of the Order's decline. The Polish-Lithuanian state had grown ever larger, and its military capability had outstripped that of the Teutonic Order. In any case, the justification for the Northern Crusades was lost as soon as the Lithuanian aristocracy converted to Catholicism, which it was doing so in the early 15th century. Indeed, the Teutonic Order had fought alongside the Lithuanians in a crusade against the Mongols of the Golden Horde in 1399. And one strange consequence of this war was the establishment of a small Tatar community in Lithuania, which to this day you can order your meal in Turkish outside Trakai Castle. And this shows the geographical extent of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth some 80 years later. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 killed the papacy's appetite for war on Orthodox Christians. The Ottoman Turks had taken the place of the Lithuanians as the leading non-Christian power confronting Eastern Europe, and by the end of the century, Grand Masters were paying homage to the Grand Dukes of vassals of the Polish-Lithuanian state. Shortly after that, Protestantism deprived the order of its lands in Western Germany. Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg converted to Lutheranism, resigned from the order, married a Danish princess, and became Duke of Brandenburg. The order endured to become a chivalric order within the Holy Roman Empire, which is another story, but its military days were over.